Royal Guard gives homeless woman a jacket, discovers she's his missing mother. James Harrison stood perfectly still outside the palace, his posture rigid and his eyes fixed straight ahead. The famous bearskin cap sat heavily on his head, and his red ceremonial uniform, usually a source of pride, felt particularly constraining tonight. The evening air had turned bitter, carrying an unusual chill for early autumn in London. He had perfected the art of remaining motionless during his 3 years as a royal guard, but tonight was testing his resolve. Not because of the cold, he had endured far worse during his military training. No, it was the quiet sobbing that kept drawing his attention to the iron gates several meters away. The woman had been there for hours, huddled against the ornate metalwork. At first, James had dismissed her as one of the many homeless individuals who sometimes sought shelter near the palace walls. But there was something different about her, something that made his chest tighten every time he caught a glimpse of her from the corner of his eye. She wore layers of mismatched clothing, all worn and dirty, but there was a dignity in the way she held herself. Even in her obvious distress, she sat with her back straight, her thin shoulders squared against the wind. Her gray hair, though tangled and unkempt, was tied back with what looked like a faded ribbon, as if she were holding on to some remnant of her former self. "Stand down," came the quiet command from his superior officer, signaling the brief rest period between shifts. Usually, James would use these precious minutes to stretch his legs or grab a quick drink of water. But tonight something else pulled at him. He found himself walking toward the gates, his boots clicking against the cobblestones. As he drew closer, he could see the woman more clearly. Her face was weathered, marked by deep lines that spoke of hardship, but there was something eerily familiar about her features. Her eyes, when she lifted them to meet his, were a striking shade of green, just like his own. "Ma'am," he said softly, trying not to startle her. "Are you all right?" She looked up at him, and for a moment, there was a flash of something in her eyes, recognition, perhaps? But it vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a vacant stare that made his heart ache. I'm waiting," she mumbled, her voice hoarse but carrying an unexpected hint of refinement. "He'll be here soon. My little boy, he always comes when it's cold." James felt an unexpected lump form in his throat. Without thinking, he began unbuttoning his ceremonial jacket. His training screamed against this breach of protocol. The uniform was sacred, a symbol of duty and tradition. But something stronger than duty moved his hands. "Please," he said, draping the warm jacket around her shoulders. "Take this." She touched the red fabric with trembling fingers, tracing the gold buttons with a reverence that seemed out of place for someone living on the streets. "Such a kind young man," she whispered, and her voice, something about it tugged at his memory, like a half-forgotten dream. "Just like my James. He was always sharing his things." James felt his breath catch. James, that was his name. But it had to be a coincidence. James was a common name, after all. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this encounter than simple charity. "You're James?" he found himself asking. "What happened to him?" The woman's face crumpled slightly, her fingers still clutching the jacket. I don't remember. There was a house with blue shutters, and a garden where we grew tomatoes." She trailed off, her eyes growing distant. "But then there was fog, so much fog in my mind. And when it cleared, he was gone. Or maybe I was gone. I can never remember which." A chill that had nothing to do with the weather ran down James's spine. His childhood home had blue shutters, and his mother had indeed grown tomatoes in their small garden. But his mother had abandoned them when he was 10, or at least that's what his father had always told him. She had simply walked out one day and never returned. "Ma'am," he started to say, but the sharp call of "Guards, attention!" cut through the air. "I have to go," he said, his training already pulling him back to his post. "But please keep the jacket. I'll check on you later." As he marched back to his position, his mind was spinning. It couldn't be her, could it? His mother had disappeared 15 years ago. This woman was clearly homeless, clearly unwell. And yet, Taking up his post again, James forced his face into its usual stoic mask. But his thoughts kept drifting to the woman by the gates, now wrapped in his ceremonial jacket. He had spent years building walls around the pain of his mother's abandonment, focusing on his military career, on becoming someone she would regret leaving behind. But as the evening grew darker and colder, he found himself wondering if perhaps he had been wrong all these years. If perhaps the story he had told himself about his mother, about her choice to leave, was not the truth at all. The palace grounds had fallen silent as midnight approached. The usual crowds of tourists had long since dispersed, leaving only the occasional echo of distant traffic and the whisper of wind through the trees. James maintained his stoic stance, but his ears were attuned to something else entirely, a soft, melodic humming that floated through the darkness. The homeless woman, still wrapped in his ceremonial jacket, had begun to rock gently back and forth. The tune she hummed was hauntingly familiar, stirring something deep in James's memory. It was a melody he hadn't heard in 15 years, yet one his heart instantly recognized. The Little Soldier's Dream. His mother had created that lullaby herself, a special song she would sing only to him. No one else knew it, not his father, not his younger sister Sarah. It had been their secret, a nightly ritual that made him feel safe and loved. The tune was simple but unique, with a distinctive bridge that his mother had added to make it extra magical for her. Little soldier, sleep tight, my brave little one, dreams of honor have just begun. Stand tall like the guards at the gate, your destiny simply cannot wait. James felt his hands trembling at his sides. How could this woman know that melody? He had never shared it with anyone, holding it close as one of his few precious memories of his mother. Yet here it was, floating through the night air with perfect accuracy, down to the slight pause before the final verse that his mother always included. Jamie boy, the woman murmured between verses, her voice barely audible. My Jamie boy needs his song. The nickname hit him like a physical blow. Jamie boy, nobody had called him that since his mother disappeared. Even in his earliest military days, he had insisted on James, deliberately distancing himself from the childhood nickname that held too many painful memories. A fellow guard, Thompson, shot him a concerned glance. James realized his posture had slipped slightly, his shoulders tensing at the sound of that long-forgotten name. He forced himself to straighten, to maintain the discipline that had become his shield against emotional turmoil. But his mind was racing. Could this really be happening? The lullaby, the nickname, these weren't common things that could be explained away as coincidence. Yet the rational part of his brain fought against the implications. His mother had been young, barely 40, when she disappeared. This woman appeared much older, worn down by years of harsh living on the streets. The humming continued, but now the woman began adding fragments of words, her voice growing more agitated. Jamie boy needs his uniform pressed, can't be late for school, where's his blue lunchbox? The one with soldiers on it. James's breath caught. He had indeed owned a blue lunchbox decorated with toy soldiers, a gift for his 10th birthday, just weeks before his mother vanished. How could this stranger know such a specific detail? As if sensing his turmoil, the woman's humming grew louder, more insistent. Other guards began to notice, shifting uncomfortably at their posts. It wasn't unusual for the homeless to cause minor disturbances, but something about this felt different. The woman wasn't being disruptive, she seemed lost in her own world of memories, memories that inexplicably aligned with James's past. Ma'am, called out Sergeant Willis, taking a step toward her. You'll need to move along now. The woman's humming stopped abruptly, her eyes wide with fear. No. I have to stay. Jamie boy marches here. I saw him in the paper, so tall in his red coat. I've been searching so long. She began frantically digging through her worn bag, pulling out crumpled newspapers. James caught glimpses of articles about the Royal Guards, some recent, others yellowed with age. Had she been collecting these, searching for him? The thought made his chest tighten. It's all right, James found himself saying, breaking protocol once again. Let her stay, Sergeant. Please. She's not causing any harm. Willis gave him a sharp look but nodded reluctantly. The woman had already resumed her humming, softer now, her fingers clutching one of the newspaper clippings to her chest. As the night wore on, James stood at his post, every fiber of his being attuned to that gentle melody. Each note pulled at him, unraveling the carefully constructed narrative he'd built around his mother's disappearance. He told himself she had chosen to leave, had walked away from her family for a new life somewhere else. It had been easier to believe that than to face the alternative, that something had happened to her, something that had torn her away from the family she clearly loved. The lullaby floated through the air once more, but this time the words were clearer, though broken by quiet sobs. When morning comes, you'll see me there, standing guard with special care. My little soldier, brave and true, Mama's heart beats just for you. In that moment, as the familiar words washed over him, James felt the walls he'd built around his heart begin to crumble. This wasn't just a homeless woman who happened to know a song. This was a mother who had never stopped searching for her child, even as her mind betrayed her and the world forgot her existence. And now, through some twist of fate, she had found her way back to him, or perhaps, he had found his way back to her. Dawn crept over London, painting the palace walls in soft, golden light. James's night shift was ending, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. He had watched the woman all night, his mind churning with possibilities. Now, as other guards prepared for the changing of the guard ceremony, he seized his chance. "I'll be taking my break now," he informed Thompson, who gave him an understanding nod. James had already shared his suspicions with his closest colleague during their brief overlap. Approaching the woman, he noticed she was still wearing his ceremonial jacket, her thin fingers tracing the gold buttons as if trying to memorize their pattern. He carried 2 paper cups of steaming tea from the guard station, extending one toward her. "Good morning," he said softly. "Would you like some tea?" She looked up, her green eyes, so much like his own, clouded with confusion. As she reached for the cup, her worn canvas bag slipped from her lap, spilling its contents across the pavement. Among the scattered newspapers and worn clothing, a small leather-bound notebook caught his eye. Oh dear," she muttered, frantically gathering her belongings. "My memories! I can't lose my memories again." James knelt to help her, his heart pounding as he picked up the notebook. It was held together with rubber bands, its pages swollen with moisture and age. As he handled it, several loose papers fluttered out. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the notebook. The woman nodded distractedly, still gathering her newspapers. Opening it carefully, James found himself staring at pages of desperate scrawls. The handwriting shifted between elegant cursive and chaotic scribbles, as if written by 2 different people, or the same person in vastly different mental states. The first entry he read made his throat tight. "Dear Diary, I think I had a son. No, I know I had a son. His name started with J. James? Jamie? He wore a blue uniform to school. St. Matthew's Primary. He loved soldiers. Why can't I remember more? Please help me remember." Another entry dated 3 years ago. "Found myself at a garden today. Blue shutters on the house. Something familiar, tomatoes growing in neat rows. A little boy's laughter. Was it my garden? My boy? The fog comes and goes. Must write quickly before it returns." James's hands trembled as he turned the pages. Each entry was a desperate attempt to hold on to fading memories, to piece together a life that was slipping away. Some pages contained nothing but his name written over and over, as if she was afraid of losing it forever. Then he found something that made his breath catch, a crumpled photograph, worn and water-stained but still recognizable. It showed a young boy in a school uniform, standing proudly next to a woman with bright eyes and a warm smile. On the back, in faded ink, "Jamie's first day at St. Matthew's, 1998. This is..." He started, his voice cracking. The woman had stopped gathering her things and was watching him intently. "You recognize it?" she asked, a spark of lucidity in her eyes. "The boy in the photo. I've been looking for him. Everyone says I'm confused, that I'm making things up. But I know he's real. I know I lost something precious. James found more evidence as he carefully turned the pages. Hospital bracelet fragments taped to pages, prescriptions for medications he didn't recognize, and desperate notes. Doctor says early onset dementia. Must write everything down. Must remember Jamie. Must find my way home before the fog takes everything. A loose page contained what appeared to be an address, written and rewritten dozens of times. 14 Maple Street, blue shutters, Tomato Garden. Home. Jamie's home. Must remember. His childhood address. I had a little boy, the woman said suddenly, her voice clearer than it had been all night. He would be a man now. A soldier like his grandfather. I see him sometimes in my dreams. Standing tall in a red coat, guarding the palace. She paused, frowning. Or perhaps that was today? The days blend together now. James found himself face to face with undeniable evidence. This notebook wasn't just a collection of random thoughts. It was a desperate mother's attempt to hold on to her identity, to find her way back to her son. Each entry, each scrap of paper, each faded photograph was a breadcrumb she had left for herself, hoping to trace her way back through the fog of her illness. The doctors, she continued, pointing to a page filled with medical terminology. They tried to help at first. But I became confused, wandered away from the hospital. By the time I found my way back, my mind was too foggy to remember my name, my family, only fragments remained. She reached for the notebook with trembling hands. But I write everything down now. Every memory, every dream, every face I think I recognize. Sometimes I read it, and it feels like someone else's life. But then I see his face, my Jamie's face, and for a moment, everything becomes clear. James stared at the final entry, dated just yesterday. Saw him again today. My soldier boy, all grown up. Standing guard at the palace, just like in my dreams. But this time I think it was real. Have I finally found him? Or is the fog playing tricks again? Must stay near. Must be sure. Must not lose him again. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't just a coincidence, or a confused woman's ramblings. This was his mother's desperate 15-year journey to find her way back to him, documented in her own handwriting, preserved despite the ravages of time and illness. The changing of the guard ceremony began in the distance, the familiar sounds of marching feet and ceremonial commands floating through the morning air. But for James, the world had narrowed to this moment, to this notebook, to the truth it revealed about his mother's disappearance. She hadn't abandoned them. She had been lost, fighting against her own mind, leaving herself clues and reminders in a desperate attempt to find her way back home. James felt the weight of the notebook in his hands, its pages holding 15 years of his mother's desperate search. His military training had taught him to approach every situation with caution and strategy, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. I need to ask you something, he said, removing his bearskin cap for the first time since his shift began. His heart thundered in his chest as he knelt beside her, no longer a royal guard but a son seeking answers. Do you remember a birthday party? There was a chocolate cake with toy soldiers on top, and one candle wouldn't light no matter how many times we tried. The woman's eyes widened, a flicker of recognition crossing her weathered face. She reached out with trembling fingers, almost but not quite touching his cheek. The trick candle, she whispered. You were so frustrated. But then you laughed. Oh, how you laughed when you realized it was a joke. Your father thought it would be funny. Her voice cracked on the word father. Dad never played jokes after you disappeared, James said softly. He changed that day. We all did. Her hand dropped to her lap, her expression clouding. Your father, Michael. He had a mustache. He always complained it made him look older, but I loved it. She paused, confusion creeping back into her eyes. But you can't be, my Jamie is small. He has a gap between his front teeth and scraped knees from climbing trees. James felt tears threatening to spill. The gap closed when my adult teeth came in, he said gently. And the scars from those scraped knees? He rolled up his uniform trousers slightly. "They're still here." She stared at the faint marks on his knee, her breathing becoming rapid. "The oak tree in the backyard," she murmured. "You fell trying to rescue Mrs. Peterson's cat. I bandaged your knees and made hot chocolate with extra marshmallows. With cinnamon," James finished. "You always added a pinch of cinnamon." Tears began rolling down her cheeks. "James Michael Harrison," she said, his full name coming out clear and strong. "My Jamie boy. My soldier." Her hands shook as she touched the medals on his uniform jacket that still draped her shoulders. "I saw you in the papers, standing so proud in this red coat. I knew it was you, but my mind, it plays tricks. I can never trust what I think I know anymore." James took her hands in his, noting how thin and cold they felt. "That's why you collected all those newspaper clippings? You were trying to find me?" She nodded, her voice becoming more urgent. "I would see your face in the photos and know you were my son, but then the fog would come, and I'd doubt everything again. Some days I wake up and can't remember my own name, but I never forgot I had a son. Even when I couldn't remember what you looked like or where to find you, I knew you were out there." "What happened that day, Mom?" James asked, the word mum feeling foreign on his tongue after so many years. "The day you disappeared?" Her face contorted with the effort of remembering. "I went to the market, or was it the doctor? There was a list in my pocket, but the words started swimming on the page. Street names stopped making sense. I tried to ask for help, but the words came out wrong." She clutched his hands tighter. "By the time I realized I was lost, I couldn't remember our address. Your father's phone number was in my head, but the numbers kept changing places." James thought of his father, making call after call to hospitals and police stations. "We searched for months," he said. "Dad hired private investigators. Sarah put up posters all over London." "Sarah?" his mother breathed. "My little girl. She was learning to braid her hair." Fresh tears fell. "How is she? Did she finish university? Did she marry that boy she liked?" "Tom?" "Tim," James corrected gently. "She married him 2 years ago. She's a pediatrician now, just like she always wanted to be." His mother smiled through her tears, but then her face crumpled. "I missed everything. All those years, all those moments, gone in the fog." She looked at him pleadingly. "There were good days when I almost found my way back. I'd remember the street name or see a familiar landmark, but then the confusion would return, worse than before. The doctors at the shelter tried to help, but without knowing my identity, without family to contact." James felt a surge of guilt. While he'd been building his career, believing his mother had abandoned them, she had been living on the streets, fighting against her own mind to find her way back to her family. "I'm here now," he said firmly, squeezing her hands. "I've found you, Mom. Or you've found me. Either way, you're not alone anymore." She looked at him with a mixture of joy and fear. "But what if I forget again? What if tomorrow I wake up and don't remember this moment? Don't remember you? Then I'll help you remember," James promised. "Every day if I have to. We'll face the fog together." For a moment, she looked at him with complete clarity, and he saw his mother, as she had been 15 years ago, strong, loving, determined. Then her eyes clouded slightly, but this time she fought against the confusion. "James," she said, gripping his hands tighter, as if he were an anchor in her stormy mind. "James Michael Harrison. My brave soldier boy." She repeated his name like a mantra, like the countless times she must have written it in her notebook, refusing to let it slip away. James felt his professional facade crumble completely as he pulled her into a gentle embrace. She felt so small in his arms, so fragile, yet he could feel her strength, the same strength that had kept her searching for him all these years. "Welcome home, Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Welcome home." By mid-morning, James had arranged for temporary leave from his duties, his commanding officer surprisingly understanding after hearing the extraordinary circumstances. Now, he sat with his mother in a quiet corner of St. Thomas Hospital, where a team of specialists had begun piecing together her medical history. Dr. Helena Chin, a neurologist specializing in early-onset dementia, studied the notebook intently while James filled in the gaps of the past 15 years. His mother, whose name they confirmed as Elizabeth Harrison, drifted in and out of lucidity beside him, sometimes gripping his hand with surprising strength, other times staring vacantly out the window. The progression of her condition is unusual, Dr. Chin explained, pointing to dates in the notebook. These early entries from 15 years ago show remarkable self-awareness. Your mother recognized the initial symptoms and tried to document everything before her memory deteriorated. James learned that his mother had first noticed problems months before her disappearance. Simple tasks became confusing. She'd find herself staring at the washing machine, unable to remember how it worked. Street names she'd known for years suddenly seemed foreign. "I kept it secret," Elizabeth said during one of her clear moments. "I didn't want to worry you and Sarah. Michael was already stressed about work. I thought I could handle it myself." The doctor showed them medical records she'd managed to track down from 15 years ago. Elizabeth had made several visits to a clinic, complaining of memory issues and disorientation. But she'd used a false name, too ashamed to admit her struggles to her family. "The day I got lost," Elizabeth continued, her voice stronger as she recalled the pivotal moment. "I'd just come from a doctor's appointment. He wanted to run more tests, said it might be serious. I was upset, distracted. The streets, they all looked the same suddenly. The buildings kept changing places." James discovered that his mother had wandered for days, growing increasingly disoriented. When police finally found her, she couldn't remember her name or address. Without ID, she'd left her purse at the clinic in her confusion. They had no way to identify her. "We did search missing persons reports," a social worker named Marion explained, joining them with more files. "But by the time the reports were filed, your mother had been admitted to a different hospital under a Jane Doe status. Her appearance had already changed significantly due to the stress and confusion." The most heartbreaking revelation came from a decade-old hospital record. Elizabeth had experienced a moment of clarity and provided her real name, but the staff member who took the information had misspelled Harrison as Henderson. The potential connection to the missing person case had been missed by a single letter. "The system failed her," Dr. Chin said quietly. "Early-onset dementia patients can experience periods of extreme confusion followed by remarkable clarity. Without proper support and documentation, they can fall through the cracks." James learned that his mother had spent years moving between shelters and hospitals, her condition making it impossible to maintain consistent care. The notebook had become her lifeline, her way of fighting against the fog that threatened to erase her identity completely. "Some days were better than others," Elizabeth said, touching the worn leather cover. "I'd remember pieces: your father's laugh, Sarah's favorite bedtime story, your toy soldiers lined up on the windowsill. I'd write everything down before it slipped away again." The medical team discovered that Elizabeth had been part of a study on early-onset dementia at one point, but she'd wandered away from the research facility during an episode of confusion. They found records of her participating in trial treatments under various names, never staying in one place long enough for the doctors to piece together her full history. "The irony," Dr. Chin noted, "is that some of these treatments showed promising results. If she'd been able to maintain consistent care, the progression of her condition might have been significantly slowed." One of the most poignant discoveries came from a series of shelter records. Elizabeth had repeatedly asked to be taken to Buckingham Palace, insisting her son was there. The staff, assuming these were confused ramblings, had gently discouraged her. "But she was right all along," James said softly. "She knew where to find me, even when she couldn't remember why." Through tears, Elizabeth explained how she'd caught glimpses of him over the years, in newspaper photos, on television during royal ceremonies, and finally in person. But each time she got close, the fog would descend, making her doubt her own memories. "I'd see you standing there in your red coat," she said, her voice breaking. "And my heart would scream that you were my son. But my My treacherous mind would whisper that I was imagining things again. The medical team was assembling a comprehensive treatment plan, but they warned that 15 years without proper care had taken its toll. The disease had progressed significantly, though Elizabeth's determination to find her family had created an extraordinary circumstance. The emotional connection to her son acted as an anchor, Dr. Chen explained. Even as other memories faded, that core mission, finding you, remained. It's actually quite remarkable from a neurological perspective. James sat with this knowledge, feeling the weight of the past 15 years, not just his own pain of believing he was abandoned, but his mother's solitary struggle against a disease that was stealing her mind piece by piece. She had never stopped fighting, never stopped trying to find her way back to her family, even when she could barely remember her own name. "I'm so sorry," he whispered to her. "All these years I thought. Elizabeth squeezed his hand. "You couldn't have known," she said clearly, having another moment of lucidity. "I didn't even know myself most days. But I never stopped loving you, Jamie. Even when I couldn't remember what love felt like, I knew I had to find you." 3 days had passed since the discovery at the palace gates. James stood in his ceremonial uniform outside his commanding officer's office, facing the most challenging decision of his military career. The morning sun glinted off his polished buttons as he thought about his mother, now safely settled in the hospital's specialized neurology ward. Colonel Blackwood, a stern man with graying temples and compassionate eyes, sat across from him, reviewing his request for extended leave. "Harrison, your service record is exemplary," the colonel said, studying the papers before him. 8 years of dedicated service, 3 as a Queen's Guard. The monarchy relies on men like you. He paused, looking up at James. "But family is sacred." James held his breath, remembering the conversation with Dr. Chen earlier that morning. The hospital had located an innovative treatment program in Edinburgh specializing in cases like his mother's. It offered hope, not for a cure, but for stabilization, for precious moments of clarity that could be stretched longer. "Sir," James began, his voice firm despite his inner turmoil, "I understand my duties to the crown. But I also understand now that I have a duty to my mother. She never abandoned her duty to find me, even when her own mind betrayed her." The colonel stood, walking to the window overlooking the palace grounds. "Do you know why I became a soldier, Harrison?" He didn't wait for an answer. "Because my father was one. He served in the Falklands, came home with medals and nightmares. But he never let those nightmares stop him from being there for his family." Turning back to James, he picked up a pen. "Request granted. 6 months leave, with the option to extend if necessary. Your position will be held." Relief flooded through James. "Thank you, sir. I don't know how to." "Don't thank me," the colonel interrupted, signing the papers. "Thank your mother. Her story, it reminds us what real courage looks like." Later that afternoon, James arrived at the hospital with news that would change everything. Sarah was already there, having flown in from Manchester the moment she heard. She sat beside their mother, showing her wedding photos on her phone. "And here's Tim trying to dance," Sarah was saying, her voice thick with emotion. "He has 2 left feet, Mom, just like Dad always did." Elizabeth smiled, touching the screen gently. "Your dress, it's the same color as the roses we used to grow." A moment of perfect recall, a gift they'd learned to treasure. James cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "I've got news," he announced, still in his full uniform. "I've taken leave from the guards. We're going to Edinburgh, Mum. All of us. There's a treatment center there." Sarah's eyes lit up with hope. "The Maxwell Institute? I've read about their work. They're doing amazing things with memory retention therapy." Their mother looked between them, confusion flickering across her face. "Edinburgh? But your duties, Jamie. The palace needs you." James knelt beside her bed, taking her hand. "The palace has many guards, Mum. But I only have one mother. And I'm not losing you again. We've already spoken to Dad," Sarah added softly. "He's meeting us there next week. He never remarried, Mum. Said his heart was still tied to a promise he made 30 years ago. Elizabeth's eyes welled with tears. Michael? He's coming? Her voice carried a mix of hope and fear. But what if I don't remember him? What if I forget all of you again? Then we'll help you remember, James said firmly. Every day, every hour if we need to. We'll make new memories while we protect the old ones. The doctors say your notebook was a brilliant idea. We're going to build on that. Photos, videos, voice recordings. Sarah pulled out a small digital recorder. I've already started, Mum. I recorded your lullaby yesterday. The one you used to sing to James. We'll make sure you never lose it again. Their mother's face lit up with sudden clarity. The little soldier's dream. I sang it every night. And now my little soldier found me. She touched James's uniform. But you're not so little anymore. No, James smiled. But I'm still your soldier. And now I'm standing guard over something far more precious than any palace. The next few hours were spent making plans. Sarah, with her medical background, had already researched everything about the Maxwell Institute. James had arranged for a comfortable flat nearby. Their father was taking time off from his accounting firm to join them. It's like... Elizabeth paused, searching for words through the fog. Like when we used to plan our summer holidays. All of us together, marking maps, making lists. Exactly like that, Sarah agreed, squeezing her hand. And this time, we're not letting you wander off on any solo adventures. As evening approached, James changed out of his uniform into civilian clothes, the first time in years he'd done so during daylight hours. He'd grown so used to the straight-backed posture and ceremonial precision of the Queen's Guard that it felt strange to be in simple jeans and a sweater. You look just like your father now, Elizabeth said softly, another moment of clarity shining through. He wore a sweater just like that when we first met. James and Sarah exchanged glances, hope burning bright in their hearts. These moments of recognition, these precious fragments of memory, were what they would fight to preserve. Tomorrow, James announced, we're starting our new adventure. The doctors say the first few months of treatment are crucial. It won't be easy, but then again, nothing worth fighting forever is. Elizabeth looked at her children, the daughter who had her determination, the son who had her strength, and smiled. I spent 15 years trying to find my way back to you, she said, her voice stronger than it had been in days. Now you're helping me find my way back to myself. As the setting sun painted the hospital room in shades of gold, the Harrison family sat together, planning their future while preserving their past. They knew there would be difficult days ahead, days when the fog would threaten to descend again. But they would face them together, a family reunited by love, determination, and a mother's unwavering quest to find her way home. James had learned that some things were worth more than duty to the crown. Some battles weren't fought with rifles and bayonets but with love, patience, and unwavering hope. And in those battles, retreat was never an option. His mother had never given up on finding him. Now it was his turn to stand guard over her recovery, to protect the precious memories they would make together, and to ensure that love would always light the way home.